Okay, so it's probably the most difficult hour of the whole conference. 3 o'clock. We all want to sleep. And now you get the theoretical physics talk. I'll try to do my best and skip the details and maybe just mention the details for the experts and tell the non-experts where they don't need to really pay attention. Before I start, Yuval asked us to prepare overview slides of the research in our groups. So just in 10 seconds to let you know that in my group we conduct 2 separate research programs. One is on quasicrystals and the other is on nanomechanics. Those of you who were here 3 years ago, I gave a talk about nanomechanics focusing on quantum dynamics of nanomechanical systems, but we also look at classical and mesoscopic, the in-between dynamics between the classical and the quantum. And today my talk will be on this side of the slide on quasicrystals, where also we have a variety of interests in this field. And I'll try to give you an overview of some of the things. So the talk is about what I like to call mesoscopic quasicrystals. Just before I start, if I don't do this now, I'll forget. Over the years, I've had quite a few collaborators working with me on quasicrystals, and a few of them are sitting here in the room. And those with stars next to their names really did, great parts of the work, and we recognized our conference chair here. So thank to all these people. Normally when people talk about quasicrystals, they have in mind these metallic alloys. So these are structures that are made out of combinations of metals that are melted together and then somehow and by various techniques grow these very nice looking structures. I'll try to be evenly obstructing. I'll watch for him and I'll be okay. So usually people think about these kinds of quasicrystals. So these are quasicrystals that are constructed on the atomic level. You take atoms of different kinds and they self-organize and create these kinds of quasicrystals. And what I want to talk about today are quasicrystals whose building block is not a single atom, but rather something much larger. I call them collectively as mesoscopic quasicrystals because the building block itself is something quite large. The first question to ask is, why do we even want to study these kinds of quasicrystals, these mesoscopic scale quasicrystals? And the first answer to that is just because we can. And if we can do something, we'll do it. These quasicrystals, we can either generate them artificially, so we produce them artificially, and they also self-assemble. And if they do self-assemble, we might want to know how to control the self-assembly of these structures. We can also use them for unique applications, and this is probably why I'm in this photonics session, because I'll show you 1 or 2 ways where you can actually make use of these special kinds of structures for expanding the library of photonics applications that we can make. And then I think most importantly is because we can use them to learn new physics. We can actually explore physics in regimes that are very difficult to study on the atomic scale, especially experimentally, where you cannot always see individual atoms. But these are fairly large building blocks, so you can actually see them and actually learn more physics than you might be able to learn on the atomic scale. But okay, I know that not everyone knows what a quasicrystal is. I'm sure that quite a lot of people know after all the news that we had after the Dan Shechtman Nobel Prize. But still, let me say some words about quasicrystals. And in fact, in order to explain what a quasicrystal is, I need to say a few words basically about what a crystal is. And this is something that's common to engineers, physicists, chemists, and biologists, because I think that today most crystallographers are biologists. I think the strong majority of crystallographers are biologists. So we all deal with crystals. So before this pivotal year, 1982, before Shechtman's discovery, a crystal was basically viewed as being an ordered solid and therefore something which is periodic. So some basic building block, a unit cell, which is repeated periodically in all directions in space, thereby indeed generating an ordered structure. And there are various important consequences that come about because of the fact that the crystal is ordered in this particular way. First of all, when we perform a diffraction experiment, whether it's X-ray diffraction, which is what, bless you, most biologists use, but this can be electron diffraction like we heard about earlier, any kind of diffraction that we perform, we will see these very sharp peaks, these so-called Bragg peaks. And the positions of these peaks satisfy various geometric properties. If you connect arrows from the center of the diffraction diagram to the peaks, and if you add two of these arrows in what we call vector addition, you find another peak, a third peak. So these sets of Bragg peaks, they're closed under this kind of arrow addition, this vector addition, and if the crystal is indeed periodic, as we thought until 82, they form a discrete array of these peaks, and in 3 dimensions, there are essentially only 14 types of arrangements that you can find for these peaks, for the lattices, these arrays that the peaks forms. Furthermore, if you look at these 14 different arrangements, you find that the rotational symmetries that they can possess are quite limited. There can be either 2, 3, 4, and 6-fold rotational symmetries. And here's an example. Here's a piece of quartz. I'm sure that many of you have held quartz crystals in their hands. And on the right-hand side, you see one of these typical diffraction diagrams showing these very bright peaks. And again, if I take 2 peaks and I take the vector sum, I find a third peak, and so on. Now, in 1982, essentially the discovery of Dan Shechtman taught us that order does not necessarily imply periodicity. What Dan Shechtman saw is a diffraction diagram which showed these very nice, sharp Bragg peaks, but whose position, and again, whose positions was closed under vector addition, the same kind of behavior that we saw in periodic crystals, but now we saw that they have arbitrary positions, essentially arbitrary positions in Fourier space. So there's no longer any restriction on the rotational symmetry that they can have. I can have any n-fold rotation symmetry that I want, and in fact, I can literally position the Bragg peaks anywhere that I want. So instead of having just 14 different options in 3-dimensional space, I now have a multitude of options in terms of the way I can position my Bragg peaks in space. And the word quasicrystal is in fact a concatenation of 2 words. It's a quasi-periodic crystal, which is something very rigorously defined in mathematics. I won't go into the definition. Again, for the experts, for the optics people, what that means is that I have a finite number of fundamental modes in the diffraction, and then all their higher harmonics. Okay, but no restrictions on the positioning of these fundamental modes that I begin with. And here is a comparison between the quartz crystal that we saw earlier and one of these typical quasicrystals, and you can very nicely see that the facets show very clear 5-fold symmetry to them. So this is these quasicrystals that I look at, and again, if one looks at the diffraction diagram of a crystal like this, these 2 do not belong to each other, but this is a typical electron diffraction diagram, and you see these very sharp peaks, and if you count how many peaks around in a circle, you'll see that you have 10 peaks in a circle. So definitely a symmetry that is impossible if the crystal is periodic. So this is necessarily a crystal that is not periodic. So this is the idea. Now, again, I mentioned the fact that, again, for the experts, I can choose, but this is also, I think, good for the crystallographers in biology. I can choose 4 of these peaks and use them in order to index all the other peaks. So these are the 4 fundamental modes. All the other peaks here are just vector sums like I show here, or like I show here, of the 4 peaks that I chose here. So the indexing of this kind of diffraction diagram will require 4 integers for every Bragg peak, as opposed to if this were a periodic crystal in 2 dimensions, then 2 integers would suffice for every peak that I have here. And this is, excuse me, just some terminology. I want to skip that. Okay, so the first thing I want to show just very quickly is the way that we can use these to learn physics is in order to simulate calculations that are difficult for us to do. And this is, in fact, one of the first uses historically for these kinds of crystals. And this goes back to 1982, the same year that Danny Shechtman discovered quasicrystals. This guy, Alan Mackay, read about the Penrose tiling. The Penrose tiling is a model, a geometrical, a two-dimensional model for one of these aperiodic crystals. And he wrote this wonderful paper entitled Crystallography in the Penrose Tiling. Essentially what he asked was, he said it would be really neat if nature somehow knew about the Penrose tiling and could arrange atoms according to the rules of the Penrose tiling. Now, so what he did is he took these circles and positioned them at the vertices of the Penrose tiling. This is what you're seeing here. It's an image from the paper. Now, he didn't know how to calculate the diffraction diagram of something like that. Today we know how to do that, but this was 30 years ago. He didn't know how to calculate that, but he said, no problem. Let's just make a slide and just calculate that using optical diffraction. And this is his calculation from the paper in 1982. So already back in 1982, there was this discovery that you can get these sharp peaks. So this is not a proof that these are really Bragg peaks, but there was an indication that one could get order without periodicity, roughly at the same time that Danny Shechtman saw it in the lab. So this is one reason. Let me take you through a very quick overview of the kinds of structures. So we saw an example now, just the diffraction grating, but the kind of structures that we can artificially generate whose order is based on this new idea that Danny Shechtman taught us about. So we can start with sticks. These are centimeter-long sticks. But if you take now centimeter-long waves, so microwaves, and you send them through these kinds of arrangements, you can actually measure the transmission through a structure which is ordered in this particular way. So this is a fairly recent paper, 2005. You can do the same kind of measurement, not with electromagnetic waves, but with sound waves. So what you see here is just an arrangement of steel rods or an arrangement of steel balls. And what you do is you just send a sound wave from one side and you record the sound that comes out from the other side. Again, these are transmission problems that are often quite difficult to calculate. Of course, you can simulate them, but analytically calculating them is quite difficult. Why not simulate them with an actual experiment rather than with a computer? So this is kind of something that people do.
How do they make
this?
No, this I see.
Oh, I'm not sure, but we can check that. It's a good friend of mine who made these. So this is something that I will emphasize in a few slides again. But now what you see is just a thin plate of a material where people just drilled holes through it. And this is a typical way of making a metamaterial. We heard about metamaterials today. Again, the arrangement of the holes here is done in such a way that this whole structure will have order with 12-fold rotational symmetry. Again, a symmetry that's impossible if the arrangements of these holes were periodic. Now, instead of physically drilling a hole in a material, one could do something which I believe is a bit more clever. And this is work done in the Moti Segev group at the Technion. What they do is they have a photorefractive crystal. This is a crystal that when you shine an electromagnetic field on it, its index of refraction changes. Now, the index of refraction, that's the thing that basically tells light how fast to move through the material. What they do in this particular experiment is they shine 5 symmetrically oriented laser beams onto this material, and what they generate here is just the overlap of these 5 different beams, and this is the experimental image. What you see here in bright spots are regions where the index of refraction has been changed a lot, and in black points where the index of refraction has not changed. And again, the arrangement of holes that we saw in the previous slide is replaced now by the arrangements of these bright spots. And you can again now ask what happens if I shine light, if I look at transport of light through this material. But now this is something that one can dynamically control and look at what happens. Now, of course, in a material like this, pretty much the minute we turn off the laser beams, maybe not the minute we turn it off, but a few seconds afterwards, there's nothing left recorded in this material. So what one can do to compensate for that is to say, okay, let's shine these 5 symmetrically oriented laser beams, but do that not on a photorefractive material like I showed you on the previous slide, but instead just take a very, very thin layer of water and put tiny little plastic balls in that layer of water. So these are micron size little plastic balls. The plastic balls, again, like in tweezing, they are dielectrics, they're non-conducting, and they like to move to regions where the intensity of the electromagnetic field is the largest, of the electric field is the largest. So again, think of the arrangement of bright spots that you saw here, and think of the little spherical particle, the little plastic particles, moving to the points where, the points that are brightest here in this image, and this is the arrangement that is formed. Now if you put some special monomers in this material that you flash UV, they solidify, then essentially at that point the structure is fixed. You can take off the light beams and you actually have a sample which has the structure that you want to make. So these are different kinds of techniques that people use in order to generate these artificially constructed mesoscopic scale quasicrystals. Now, once we know how to make them, we can indeed use them for various applications. How much time do I have? Okay. And I'll mention these 2 photonics applications. So the first of all, well, before mentioning the application, again, emphasizing what the underlying idea here is behind the application. So again, the underlying idea is that we have Bragg peak diffraction. We have material that if we perform a diffraction experiment, we see very sharp Bragg peaks. Now, it turns out that there are several applications whose basic idea relies on having these Bragg peak diffractions. One of them are applications for having band gaps in material. So if you have these Bragg peaks, you have what we call Bragg reflection, and you can generate material where certain bandwidths of light, certain frequencies of light essentially cannot penetrate into this material. And this is because of the way that the holes are punched in that plate that we saw earlier, and I'm showing you here again. Now, often when you make these band gap materials, so materials that will not let light into them, the ability to stop light depends on the direction in space. So you might be able to stop light in that direction, but maybe not necessarily in a different direction. Often what you want is to be able to stop light in all directions in space. Now, if all you know about in terms of structures that can generate Bragg peaks, if all you know about are just periodic structures, then at least in 2 dimension, the structure that has the symmetry that's closest to a circle is a structure with 6-fold rotational symmetry. You can't do better than that with a periodic crystal. So you can get something which is almost isotropic, but still you have variations at the level of the difference between a hexagon and a circle. Now here we easily, very easily, can create a structure that has 12-fold rotational symmetry. So now you want to compare the dodecagon, the 12-sided, I'm missing a word, polygon, thank you, to a circle. And this is now much, much more similar to a circle than a hexagon is. So here you have applications where you have really isotropic band gap materials.
What happens if you have 2 concentric 6-fold symmetry items?
Let's talk about that later, because I have a few more stories that I want to tell. The second application is actually an application that was part of Alon's PhD thesis in a DRS group, and this has to do with the quest to perform frequency conversion processes in a nonlinear material. Because I don't have a lot of time, let me go very quickly. Again, the experts will understand. The non-experts, I'll tell you what you need to note. So in general, what we want to do is to, for example, take 2, say, infrared laser beams and add their frequencies. So you double the frequency, and instead of having there's one laser beam, but you take two photons, two elementary light particles with this characteristic, and instead of them, you generate a third, which has twice the frequency. Now, the light has two properties. It has its frequency as a property, and it also has the wavelength of the light as a property, or as I've written it here, the wave vector, the wave number describing both the wavelength and the direction of propagation of the light. And when you add frequencies in this way, you have to satisfy two requirements. The frequency of the output light has to be the sum of the frequencies that come in, and the wave number of the light that comes out has to be the sum of the wave numbers that come in. And the problem that one encounters in many of these materials is that the relation between frequency and wave number in the material, so these are not two independent properties, they depend on each other. These relations usually do not allow to satisfy both of these requirements together. So the engineers call this problem a phase matching problem. From a physics point of view, this is a problem of not being able to satisfy both energy conservation and momentum conservation. So there's lack of conservation of momentum. So if I look at K3, I find that it's K1 plus K2 plus something that is missing. Now what physicists have known for a very long time, and this solution was proposed in 1962, is that if you have an ordered structure, if you have a structure whose diffraction diagram contains Bragg peaks, the positions of these Bragg peaks can replace exactly this missing momentum, this missing wave vector. So if I have a Bragg peak in the diffraction whose distance from the origin and direction is the same of the size of this wave number in its direction, then momentum is conserved. So within the ordered structure, one doesn't need to conserve momentum, but something that we call crystal momentum. It's a variant of that. So the idea is to generate artificially a metamaterial whose diffraction diagram will contain all the missing wave vectors that we need in order to generate all the multitude of frequency generation processes that we want to generate. And I think you saw this image in Dee's opening slide earlier. What they actually did here is to generate a structure that would take in three different frequencies, omega 1, omega 2, omega 3, and simultaneously generate twice the frequency for each of these input beams. So 2 omega 1, 2 omega 2, and 2 omega 3. So one really has three different missing wave numbers here that one needs to put, 5 minutes? That one needs to put in the diffraction diagram. But it turns out that we know how to do that. We have the knowledge from the theory of quasicrystals that allows us to generate a real space structure given any set of wave vectors that you wish to find. Again, I emphasize the point that I emphasized at the beginning of a lecture. We have complete flexibility in terms of positioning Bragg peaks in the diffraction diagram. So you tell us where you want to put your Bragg peaks, and Alon has this quick calculation, and immediately he tells you this is the structure that you need to generate. This is a 1D structure, comparison of theory of experiment. This is a 2D structure, and there's a lot that can be done here. And I want to say, in the last 3 or 4 minutes, very quickly, something about the way that we can use these kinds of structures to study the growth and stability of quasicrystals. So I'll really go very, very quickly. It turns out that in the last decade or so, we've seen in nature structures that self-assemble into quasi-periodic order, so quasicrystals, whose building blocks are huge. So these are not single atoms, but huge molecules. So here you have a very complicated dendrimer. These dendrimers have the shape of a cone, but when you put a lot of dendrimers together, they form a sphere, a micelle. And under certain conditions, these micelles form a structure which is ordered and has 12-fold symmetry. Okay, and this is the experimental diffraction diagram. You can count 12 points around the circle. There are other systems of polymers that form structures with 12-fold symmetry. This is a system of nanoparticles. This is iron oxide and gold, very small nanocrystals covered by some chemistry so they won't stick together. And again, under certain circumstances, they create a structure with, again, 12-fold symmetry. This is a two-dimensional structure. Mesoporous silica. So there's really a lot of different structures that have popped up in the last 10 years or so. Again, the building block is huge, and they just self-assemble into a quasicrystal with 12-fold symmetry. So we were very intrigued by this. First of all, the immediate question that comes up is, why are all of these 12-fold symmetric? In the solid state, in the metallic alloys, the symmetries that we usually see are 5-fold and 10-fold. We very rarely see 12-fold, and here we see 12-fold. Once we understand this and the origin of stability of these, maybe we can actually control and predict the structures. Maybe we can synthesize these molecules to give us the structure that we want to make, and then maybe we can apply these to photonics and other applications. So, let me skip some of these details. We really were able to show, after some thought, by using very simple, again for the experts, very simple mean field theory with a very simple free energy that we wrote down, that in order to stabilize these quasicrystals, we really need two simple ingredients. The interactions between the particles, between these building blocks, should contain two length scales. And the chemist or whoever is synthesizing this should have the ability to tune the ratio of these two length scales. And a second requirement is to have many body, at least 3 body effective interaction between these particles, but entropy, again for the experts, entropy can be enough to generate these effective many body interactions. And then we know how to design the potential, and we were able to show that we can design potentials that give these nice 12-fold symmetric particles. Let me just finish with this last question. You might ask, okay, this is a mean field theory. Can we do this with actual particles? And we have more fairly recent, and not very new anymore, but more fairly recent results where we can now design the pair potentials. So what you see here in 4 different colors are 4 different interaction potentials between 2 such particles. So this basically tells us the energy between the particles as a function of the distance between each other. Now these potentials, they have a lot of wiggles. It's very difficult to predict just by looking at this what the structure is going to be. But these are potentials that we designed. We designed the red one and the green one to give us a 12-fold symmetric crystal. We designed the blue one to give a hexagonal crystal, and the pink one to give a square crystal. And we give these potentials to our colleague who knows how to do molecular dynamic simulations. He doesn't know how we design this, so we just give him the potentials and tell him, just simulate this and see what you get. And what we get is the following. So when we expect to get 6-fold crystals, we get these kinds of what are called cluster crystals or cluster phases. So you have clusters of overlapping particles. These are very soft molecules, so they can really interpenetrate and overlap. So there's no order within each cluster, but you can clearly see that the clusters generate a 6-fold crystal. And here you see the diffraction, the calculated diffraction diagram of this. And then we change, again, we're talking about changing the relative length, the relative length scale. That we have 2 length scales and the ratio between these 2 length scales. And we set it to get a 4-fold crystal. And indeed, we get this square crystal again made out of clusters. And finally, when we set it to give us the 12-fold crystals, then we get this really nice and beautiful cluster quasicrystal. And here again, you see the calculated Fourier diagram of this. So it seems that our theory works, but now we're looking for people in the audience, Roy and others, who actually have some kind of soft building blocks that they can synthesize and vary the pair potentials in order to test this in a real laboratory setting. So, and I won't say anything about studying dynamics. I'll just show you this little movie of, again, these plastic particles in the water under this external potential. This is in a real room at room temperature. These things wiggle around. There's a lot of dynamics going on here. And we can study it on an individual, on an atomic level. So this is it. Thank you very much. Where's the coffee?
So I have a question.
Yes?
A general question. One of the first slides, we saw a quasicrystal, a pattern, and the macroscopic crystal that you find. So why the macroscopic shape has some features of the unit cell? Not of the unit cell, but of the symmetry of the...
So the question was, how is it that the morphology of the crystal, when you hold it in your hand and you look at the outside form of the crystal, why does that reflect the internal symmetry of the, the microscopics of the crystal? This is a question that you could have asked about periodic crystals. It dates back to early work from the 17th and 18th century. Essentially, the idea is that when you do have this ordering on the atomic level, now you kind of chop it off, or you naturally let it break. And when you chop these things off, they do find these very nice facets. The facets are related, to these so-called Miller indices and the Bragg peaks and so on. So this whole theory still applies for the quasicrystal. You can still talk about these Miller indices. You can still talk about this whole language. And so the external morphology, of course, it depends on how you grow the quasicrystal, and so on, but the external morphology will definitely reflect the internal microscopic ordering.